So whenever Marco comes to talk to us, in fact this time more severely than the last time, I have this sort of mixed reaction, a kind of divided reaction. I mean, on the one hand, I'm encouraged by the thought that the European Commission has this range of problems on its agenda. There's something reassuring about the fact that you size up the range of problems the way you do. And then one faces the range of problems and one thinks of the political means at our disposal to address any of them, and the other feeling overtakes me, which is one of a sort of blank despair. And so I'm sure everyone many people in the room will be sharing this reaction. If you don't, that'd be fascinating to hear. And I'm sure we'll be chewing over this in the Q&A. But so let me make a first sort of stab at trying to get at these things. I mean, one response might be to say, okay, you're being alarmist. So obviously things are bad in various ways, but one could think of local political reasons why the United States, facing the political troubles that it does at the moment from the point of view of global governance. Perhaps one should view the entire process of fragmentation that you start with as, in fact, in some sense, simply the result of the success of the programme of global growth. The process of global growth produced a much more polycentric system because it empowered emerging markets, which are no longer emerging, really. They're now very sophisticated actors, many of them very large, and China the largest of all. And what did we expect? I mean, surely we should have expected, and people since the 60s, if you go back to Walt Rostow or somebody like that in the 60s, he's expecting a fragmentation of power to happen. And the only question really is what kind of constructive process of re-coordination, of re-articulation can go on, and that's a new and novel conversation. And it's one that's threatening to the hegemony of existing incumbent powers like the United States. And so you wouldn't expect that to go well at first. And so perhaps the situation we're in is one in which we're just adjusting to a truly unprecedented burst of economic growth, which particularly in the early 2000s, we have Brad Setzer in the room here as one of the great analysts of the American balance of payments. And I'd love him to weigh in later on. But there's a particular China shock, if you like, to the global economy in the early 2000s. And in some sense, the situation, the conversation in America, and to a lesser extent even in Europe, could be seen as the sort of belated after effect of that shock. And maybe that's the historic scenario we're living through. So that would be the kind of deflationary. Don't panic, carry on, things will shake out. In your itemization of the big actors in the system, Beijing looks as though it might be the most coherent actor. And since it's the rising power, accountable for about 30% of global growth in the current conjuncture, that could be seen as a reassuring fact. But then on the other hand, and there is, as you say, also the sense that we are at a critical juncture. In other words, that we don't really have the leisure of waiting, that we can't just allow the historic kind of vista that I've just laid out to be our guiding light. That there are all sorts of possibilities for derailment, which could be the reflux of a sort of mercantilist economic nationalism of the 1980s, which seems to be the most intelligent interpretation of what Robert Lighthizer is up to. In other words, America is refighting a kind of that first phase of the mercantilist battle against Japan, and that's what we're dealing with. Or we could, and I don't know how free you feel to comment on this, or we could be dealing with what might be an existential test of the Eurozone in the next 6 to 12 months with Italy as the flashpoint. Too big to fail, too big to bail, and without the EU being in a position to really do something about it. So we could be at a moment of truly existential threat, and this isn't even to bring in, say, climate change as a ticking clock, which according to the latest analysis gives us a decade or so to do something dramatic, or we're facing truly cataclysmic change. So I'm kind of torn between those two different perspectives on your presentation. On the one hand, wanting to relativize and say, well, give this another couple of decades and some new order will emerge, almost certainly with China having the decisive voice, and we'll just have to wait and see. On the other hand, that kind of more alarmist time frame, which I think also hovers in the background of your mind, which is actually this is a critical period. This is a period of 2 or 3 years in which something has to happen. And the question then, of course, which, in your position, I don't know what your limits are, what you're free to say, but that then becomes a fundamentally political question. Where is the agency going to come from, either on the United States side or in Europe, that might allow a coherent response to what are questions which are urgent and pressing? And if one multiplies your very interesting 2 by 2 on the European political scenes, because that, as it were, allocates each country to a particular place. But of course, each country is itself basically internally split between those 4. And what you're doing is pegging the country according to what you take to be the preponderant position. But the complexity of European politics is that it is fractal, it splits again internally. Under those circumstances, and particularly given the position in Germany, what is the prospect of a coherent response even to a domestic Eurozone crisis, let alone some of the larger global challenges that you've put on the agenda? So I'm sort of that. I mean, this isn't really a question so much as a request to you to elaborate a little bit more on where this list, as you yourself described it, this shopping list of governance things that ought to be addressed, where that fits in an assessment of our historical situation. Is this the prospect of a relatively sanguine economist who knows the story of global growth and says, why are we complaining? This is one of the great moments for human history. Or is this the voice of an urgency that says this is a critical moment? Because using the historical historical comparison, we may have missed 1929, but 10 years on puts you in 39, and I don't think we are in 39, and that would be kind of fatuous to suggest that. But what ultimately brought the resolution of the 1930s conjuncture was the war, and out of that then came the concertedness, the coordination of Western power that enabled 44 and 45 and the construction of those institutions, and no one in their right mind would advocate that as a scenario through which we would arrive at a more competent mode of governance. But that's the kind of confusion that I'm left in listening to your talk.
Well, this is I think it's for the audience and not only.
No, absolutely.
Not only for me to answer, and you push me well outside my comfort zone. No, I think nonetheless, if you take the 2 perspectives here, I have to say that I would not belittle what is happening here as something physiological that would then be the normal. Normally would be recomposed.
Growing pains. This is growing pains.
Yeah, growing pain. I don't think so. And actually, if you put together the various fragmentations that we have that I have tried to lay out for you, and I think very very important the point that you stress, namely that within also individual players you have this inner fragmentations as well, which is goes can't be synthesized into the populist backlash of different sorts. Then I think it would be far too complacent to conclude that these are growing pains. It is repetition of episodes in the past, which at the end of the day ended up reasonably well. I think here the risk that we have is that we end up in very fragmented global economy, which I think would be highly problematic if one looks at prosperity looking going forward. I think it's an existential test, yet again existential test for Europe. I mean, I have been, and I tell you also my practical experience here. I was back in June. I went 2 weeks difference. First to Beijing and then to Mumbai. because we have macro financial dialogues with a number of emerging economies, with large number of emerging economies. So these two, I did it one after the other, and what I came out with, and the rapid succession in a sense made it even more flagrant, was the demand for Europe to take a more proactive approach in global governance. So take a leadership approach. That was the demand, in a different way from China and India. China more of a top-down approach, India more of a bottom-up, I think also based on support for concrete projects. That what we are doing also, the compact with Africa, the help in development, including India. So the two in a different way, but a clear demand for more protagonism and more leadership on the part of Europe. So if one looks forward, really I find that this role of Europe in global governance, the global economy, should be, let's say, an additional motivation to put our house in order and to finish the work that we have undertaken, and this implies completing EMU, and we know the difficulty that we have there, the lack of leadership that currently haunt us in a number of large countries, or some, including those changing quadrants, which actually push back instead of helping, either subjectively or objectively. But this role in global governance is really for us a great opportunity. Whether there is sufficient leadership awareness and foresightness to raise up to the challenge, that is still a question mark.
So, can I push you on Italy? Because that presumably, from the point of view of...
I think I need to refill.
from the point of view of global financial market actors, I mean, I was in Europe, I've been in Europe on and off in the last couple of weeks, and it is striking the difference between conversations you have with American observers who are frankly really worried about Italy, and say in Paris, there was to my mind, astonishing sort of blithe insouciance, shall we say, about the Italian situation. And I found this very surprising, and this disjuncture, because
I think you have not met the right persons.
I have not met the right people. Right. Well, that's very good to hear, because I came away thinking, wake up, smell the coffee. This looks like the real deal. And it's not at all obvious, given the points that you're making about Eurozone governance, whether or not the elements of a solution are there. If you compare Europe's situation now with what it was even at the worst points of the Eurozone crisis, you would have to say that in political terms, surely Europe's position is weaker even than it was then. If one of the handicaps in dealing with the height of the crisis in 2011-2012 was the then weakness of the German coalition, the fragility of the FDP's vote in the opinion polls, the situation is now infinitely worse, and this is no longer small parties but the two formerly largest parties in the German political system. We now have manifestly anti-EU parties governing in one of the major member states. The situation in political terms is much, much more precarious than it was. We have a change of leadership in the ECB upcoming, so not a fresh new team coming in willing to make bold steps. We have QE, apparently a spent instrument of policy that the ECB seems determined to wind up precisely at a moment when the bond markets need reassurance. I mean, nothing about this scenario looks anything other than alarming, and this doesn't look like the platform on which the EU could mount a constructive role in global governance, especially when one then compounds it with the fact that the growth strategy, such as it is, consists of that extraordinary, I believe, in economic history, unprecedented, surplus. Unprecedented in the sense that no unit as large as the Eurozone or the EU has ever run a surplus this large for as long as it has. I mean, that looks like the opposite of what one would hope for as the platform for a larger and more constructive role.
I mean, I try always to be, pretty frank and candid here in this presentation, and when, especially for events like this, I do not come with the official commission hat, telling you the prep talk and the mantras on this. So I think one has to look at things with in a very sober way. Let me first deal with the issue of Italy. What we are trying to do in terms of the completion of economic and monetary union is to proceed in balanced way, trying to emphasize the two quadrants in a vertical way. So putting elements of risk reduction going hand in hand with element of risk sharing. So reducing the risk in the banking system, in the financial system, in the public finances on one hand, and also put the emphasis on risk sharing, especially completion of banking union, establishing a central fiscal capacity, at least an embryo of that, which is an element of risk sharing. Now, let me open and close a bracket here. I don't think that characterizing the risk sharing and risk reduction in, let's say, very conceptually very separate way is a correct thing to do. And I think actually it is pretty wrong analytically. So certain elements which are usually in countries like Germany or the Netherlands put in the risk sharing side, they actually help to reduce risks.
So let's be concrete here.
No, for instance, take what we. I mean, if we set up a central stabilization function, this is usually apportioned to the risk sharing side.
So a concession by Germany to.
It's a concession by Germany and the Netherlands. At the same time, I mean, you can look at this as actually reducing the risks, because you are able, in the case of large shocks, to respond in an effective way and reduce the likelihood that countries actually pushed against the wall and beyond, and they have to go to the ESM to ask for for an adjustment program. So I think that element there is a certain element of risk sharing, but it is an element also of risk reduction.
So to make this concrete, if there was a large and substantial common unemployment insurance fund, this would have the effect of unburdening the automatic stabilizers at a national level, and that would reduce the chance of a fiscal crisis sliding a country into a crisis category.
I would think so, yes. That doesn't mean that this should replace the room for maneuver at the national level that will have to be created, especially in good times, because the first line of defense in case of a negative shock is the automatic stabilizers and fiscal policy at the national level. But the experience is that when you have particularly large shocks, what can be done at the national level is not enough. Then having something which helps cushion the shock at the central level, helps to reduce the likelihood that countries are pushed into an adjustment program. And let me say this, my experience, but these brackets here becomes very long, but okay, but try to close it at a certain point. My experience looking at the kitchen, so how things and decision making goes, going into a program is clearly a drama for the recipient country.
This is a European debt crisis adjustment program.
So having the Troika coming home.
Brussels mandated adjustments
so
to the welfare policy.
IMF or the ESM program.
Thing that happened to Greece.
So it is, Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Spain, as far as the program for the banks are concerned. So it is definitely a drama politically for the countries who have to apply for this. But my experience that it is a drama also for the creditor countries, because when you have to push the support to other countries through the Bundestag or through the Dutch parliament or to the Finnish parliament, it is a very strong, a huge political problem. So if you have systems, so you have shock absorbers which help to shield the country before they get to the ultimate step and have it to apply for a program. I think is a risk reduction, is a plus not only for the debtor countries but also for the creditors ones. So this is I close the bracket here. So with all these qualifications, the current approach is that we have to try to pair risk reduction and risk sharing. Then, if you have a country which actually does not accept to play by the, basic rules of the game, so the perception is actually increases the risks, then it becomes far too easy for those who are reluctant on the risk sharing side to say, actually I do not want to share risks in these conditions here. I have a point of qualification on this, which I think is an important one. One could have expected also the opposite reaction on the part of the others, saying that instead of sharing less because I fear you because you are increasing the risks for yourself and for the system as a whole, I'd actually go ahead and increase the risk-sharing mechanisms on the conditions that you can apply only, participating in this only if you actually behave and play by the rules of the game. So one could have had, or could have, a completely different approach, actually the opposite one. But here the issue of political leadership and political strength comes into play. Weak political leaders would choose the first, so not to share more, but to share less, because you fear the other. Foresighted political leaders, strong political leaders, would actually go for the second and put conditions for you to participate into this. We are not in a period of strong political leadership, so my prediction, which is a relatively easy one, is that the first approach will actually prevail. So this may reduce the likelihood that we make a huge breakthrough come the Euro Area Summit in December. I hope we make good progress on banking union, on the backstop for the Single Resolution Fund, which is the second pillar of banking union. We strengthen the ESM to be more like the IMF for certain in certain regards, but it is clear that the present political configurations and is not very conducive to huge advancements on that. So there is considerable worries in Europe on this, and I hope that the kind of interactions that we have right now would allow to come to a composition of this conflict. We are going to apply the rules the way, in an intelligent way, as I think we have done in the past several years, knowing that it is a situation in which the likelihood of being battered as Commission anyway would be there, because if one proceeds by the applying the rule strictly, will be criticized for being the blindless bureaucrats which apply the rules in a blind way. If one gives in, then one is criticized because of we do not apply the rules, and because maybe banging with a shoe, as happened literally with Pierre Moscovici a few days ago. If you have not seen the episodes, I will show it to you on YouTube. So someone banging the shoe on the table, and you see it pays off to take a very muscular approach. So one would be criticized anyway. So in these conditions, having to face a criticism anyway, we better do the right thing.
Thank you.
Let's have some questions from the floor. Who have we got? Lady at the front here.
What consequences, if any, what consequences, if any, might there be if in May the European Parliament is overtaken by the populists, sovereignists, and similar? I am really terrified by it. I'm Italian as well.
If you could tell us who you are when you ask a question, so Marco has an idea of who he's responding to. If you could just introduce yourself.
I'm no one. I mean, I am Italian.
There's no such
I
thing.
have nothing to do with discussions of politics. Well, I have a lot to do, but anyway, my former profession was teaching Dante at the university level.
Well, we're delighted to have you here. Great question.
Okay.
And
No.
my name is Giuliana Carugatti. That means that I am from Milan.
Okay, I am not going to answer a very hypothetical question, but I'm going to answer more directly. It's not going to happen. Now, so this is next year I come back. We'll see each other again. Let's see if I got it right. Now, one thing that is, and I'd like to go back, complementing your question to some of Adam's observations before. It is true that they have this splintering in Europe, quite a lot of criticism, etc. But if you look at the latest polls in terms of the perception of Europe, if a Eurobarometer actually has not been published, I've just seen the results now. Support for Europe, European integration, support for more coordination, more things to be done together, in particular support for the euro, this has gone up dramatically.
Yeah, all-time highs, aren't they?
You know, all-time high. It was already all-time high before, and now it has become even more glaring that there is this very strong support. So I think, I hope from here till May, reality would catch up with, or let's say perception would catch up with reality, and actually having, acknowledging, and that the, on the global arena, as well as in the challenges that we face, the critical mass cannot be anything below the, the European level. So I think I'm reasonably, I'm not saying optimistic, but reasonably confident that at the end of the day we are going to see advancement of these anti-European forces, but not taking, not achieving the majority or anything like that. So if you look at the Eurobarometer on confidence in Europe versus confidence in the nation state, or European institutions versus national institutions, it is pretty amazing. I mean, the gap that you have in favor of Europe. Italy, it is true, is an outlier for this. So it has tilted from being the most pro-European country traditionally, in a very acritical way, actually not realizing what it meant, to being the most skeptical one. But even there, support for exiting the euro is 20%, having gone down very strongly. So when it comes to the crunch, I think people will realize that their savings are in danger, and the growth prospects also. I hopefully they make the right choice. I have to say, if I go back to the French presidential elections, what made the difference there, or one of the factors that made the difference between the first and the second round, was the perception that with Marine Le Pen exiting from the euro could be a concrete possibility, and this certainly helped to tilt the public opinion in favor of Emmanuel Macron.
I'm going to take a couple of questions back to back. So we could start with the gentleman here, then the young woman here, and then the gentleman in the blue shirt.
So my name is Peter Linseth. I'm a professor of law at the University of Connecticut. I'm also a visiting professor at Queen Mary University of London. I want to press actually on your response, because it's not so much that I disagree with you. I think that it's conceivable that a pro-European majority, not even conceivable, but likely the pro-European majority will be elected in the European Parliament. It's that the European Parliament is irrelevant for the most important indicia of power and legitimacy, and that is the capacity to actually mobilize resources, human and fiscal, in order to address the problems that Europe faces. So we can look at, Eurobarometer polls until we're blue in the face, but until European leaders, but also the electorates to which they respond, are prepared to actually supranationalize this mobilization of resources, including what you were saying, at least in embryonic fiscal capacity. You can't recycle the surpluses. You can't achieve the kind of balanced growth model that you'd like to see. You can't engage in borrowing at the EU level that might support, say, a European safe asset. So it seems to me that there's just any number of things on your laundry list that Europe needs to do that is ultimately dependent on not so much what polls say about confidence in Europe. Well, sure, they have confidence in Europe doing what Europe is capable of doing, but they are certain that the actual locus of robust democratic legitimacy remains national, because that is, and the primary indicator is that is where resources can be legitimately mobilized. And that's the true source of fragmentation.
A question of the woman at the back here, just there.
My name is Clara Shin. I'm an alumni here at Columbia, and I'm working as a political researcher at Korean Consulate General. I have a question about national security tariffs, Section 232. I believe it's gonna have a directly impact on Europe and Japan and South Korea and their car exports. So do you think the Trump administration actually carry out, enforce it? And if that is the case, how can these countries react to it? Thank you.
And then gentleman here in the light blue shirt. And then I'll give Marco a chance to respond.
Thank you. I think Japan is a counterexample for everything we've been talking about, in that it's a high-income economy that's had slow growth for 30 years, and repeated failures of economic policy, disastrous fiscal situation, and yet it hasn't suffered the kind of fragmentation internally that we've seen in many other countries. What do you think is different about Japan that has prevented it from suffering from these kinds of problems? And by the way, my name is Giulio Martini, and I'm a fund manager.
Sorry, what can you say it again? What prevented
why hasn't Japan suffered from the kind of fragmentation that we're seeing in European countries and with other economies that it's connected with?
So you've got Japan, you've got car tariffs, and you've got the harsh realities of European politics and the gap between opinion polls and...
Okay, now some of these questions I'm not able to answer fully. Some others I would be able to, but I am not. I decide not to.
That's the idea of bundling them.
Now, on the issue of legitimacy and European Parliament. Okay, first of all. We say it, at least in Brussels, in the Brussels belt, we say it every single time, and maybe this time we have really a chance, is to have the European elections of next May not as a mega poll of national popularity, but as truly European elections. The challenges are monumental, and I think we have. What is reshaping here is not only the along the classic political divide, the political families, but also decisively whether we go towards a more European integration with the right safeguards, obviously, and taking into account the realities, or whether we go back in a massive way. And I think it is the opportunity to really put on the table issues where it is self-evident that without a coordinated and a cohesive European approach, you are not going to be able to solve or to tackle the problems. I mean, starting with migration, just to mention that. I think that describing the European Parliament as toothless, I think is not correct. You're not doing that.
I'm not saying that.
No, you're not.
It's important within the confines of what Europe can do, but it's not where resources are in fact mobilized.
No, that is also partly true, because I mean what we have on the table now is the new multi-year budget that has been put forward by the Commission, and on which the negotiations are going ahead strongly, and this time round, actually, we have a budget proposals which is much less, let's say, in continuity with the past that we had, what we have had. So the shift of resources to what we call new European public goods, I think is important, and they are resources and backing policies which actually respond to the kind of demands that we have, and I mentioned Eurobarometer before. I mean, you have resources for security, for border control, for immigration policy, but also for fostering new technologies, digitalization, completing the digital single market, which has underpin the growth potential looking forward. And the European Parliament is a co-legislator on that. So I think one should not it should not belittle the importance that European Parliament will have in the next year and years, even though I agree with you to make this this being perceived in a clear way by the population is it is very hard. On the mobilization of surpluses, moving to more, as I mentioned before, more indigenous growth. I think here policies where both Council and Parliament are actually co-legislator are important. I mean, we have a whole set of proposals on completing Capital Markets Union. Capital Markets Union is fundamental to recycle the excess surpluses that you mentioned, and do it in the right way, instead of creating, as in the pre-crisis years, the recycling of surpluses ending up by creating more debt and going to the wrong place, fueling bubbles and housing market booms. They should go to the to productivity enhancing sectors, and here Capital Markets Union is actually one of the conditions in order to do so, and do that via equity and not via debt, which is, I think, more robust. On the fiscal capacity, what we have put forward is something which is in partly rooted in the EU budget. So it is, I admit, pretty small, but it is, we have to start from somewhere, given the very different positions by the member states, coupled with also an intergovernmental part where countries can decide to add resources over and above those of the EU budget. So I think if we enter the campaign with a proper frame of mind, I think we would have the chance, to discuss properly and make sure that those feelings that I mentioned before, which found evidence in the Eurobarometer, also find the political translation in a way that is a more constructive one. Now, on car exports, I think is an issue that concerns Europe as well, not only US, Japan, and Korea. And here I don't have anything to really elaborate on, if not to say that we are struggling following the meeting of President Trump with President Juncker back in July, to avoid enter in an outright trade war, which I think would be extremely detrimental. And I don't have a clear answer on Japan. Maybe Japan has the type of internal cohesion which we probably still do not have in Europe. At the same time, you see the experience of Japan with a very low growth, very stagnant demography, which is a recipe for society which is very rich but also pretty static. And Adam, you mentioned before a bit of the possible rerun of the policies that we had and the fears that we had at the time back 1980s on Japan taking over the global economy. Nobody's thinking about that anymore.
No. Do we have one last round of questions for Marco? Yes, at the back. Gentleman at the back, and then Chuck Sable. I'll make that the last two.
Hi, I'm James Anderson. I'm a research analyst. I was just wondering, one of the recurring criticisms of the EU has been that having a full monetary union without full fiscal union will create tensions within the Eurozone. I'm just wondering, you came in, I think, 2008 and have been for the past 10 years working there, so what has your experience been in watching some countries recover faster than others, some being unwilling to commit to the fiscal surplus needed to help boost other economies?
Thank you. And then at the front here, Chuck. So, Chuck, can you put your hand up so the mic can get to you?
Thank you. I feel a little awkward asking this question again because your obvious decency and goodwill shows through, but I'm going to plunge ahead and come back to the question that Adam asked you. He said, which between the two views, growing pains and existential crisis, which do you favor? And you very delicately said you reject the organic view, which I take to be the growing pains view. But your entire program is the current generation of the very sensible and to me completely compelling normal growth responses of the EU to the short-term urgent coordination problems which produce an accretion of collective sovereignty of some indefinite type, which we could even say should be an example to the rest of the globe of how to manage globalization. But that's how the EU has grown, exactly through a process which never talked openly or in a compelling way about its own political goals, what it all amounted to. And it would be terrific, I think, if the silence on these matters that had led to the success that you've achieved could continue. But in the face of an existential crisis, the possibility of an existential crisis, where people are demanding some kind of a political vision, including, for example, a political vision of the EU which solves coordination problems in an urgent way, but doesn't actually create a kind of sovereignty which is competitive with national sovereignty, some understanding of exactly the novelty of the EU that you were gesturing at in your remarks, which is politically compelling. Seems like if not an indispensable condition of succeeding in the face of a possible crisis, at least a useful backstop and maybe even a moral imperative given the demand for the kind of reconciliation of EU sovereignty and national democracy? Just wondering what your thoughts are.
Over to you, Michael.
Okay, no, thanks. Thank you very much for these two questions. The first one is easier than the second. On fiscal union and versus monetary union. Actually, I'm going to make a presentation at Harvard tomorrow on the 20 years of the euro. So I was hesitating whether to do this, what I've done today, or maybe I come next year on the 20 on the 20 years. But
assuming there is.
So I know, but I don't. And what I've done there. Then I put the slides in circulation. So I mean, you can also for the other events. So you can see I've done a bit the same type of exercise that I've done here. Early beliefs when we launched the euro, and now, as I've done here, early beliefs on globalization and the way we appreciate it here. And what was thought about at the beginning of the euro was that, they say, basically negative coordination would be enough. Negative coordination meaning that you centralize monetary policy, but as far as the other policies, fiscal as well as, let's call it structural policies in general and reforms, you can keep it decentralized. Fiscally, you have rules, and that is the negative element. So don't do certain things. Don't run excessive deficit. And here we have the parameters of 60%, 3%. And that the thought at the time was that this would be largely enough. So basically, monetary policy would deal with common shocks and established strong credibility by the central bank and keep low inflation. And then when you have to deal with asymmetric shocks, you would have created sufficient room for maneuver in the budget below the 3% to respond by automatic stabilizers. The experience, fast forwarding to today, was that this was not enough. That's why we consider very much that fiscal capacity of some sort is needed. This does not imply that countries would, not have to create the room for maneuver under the, in order to have this capacity to respond at the national level. But the experience that we have had is that you have certain shocks that I mentioned before, for which national response is not enough. So what we would need as part of fiscal union is certainly a central fiscal capacity which would allow to respond to large shocks. Not for everyday disturbances or normal cyclical fluctuations, but for large shocks, yes. Would fiscal union imply that there is a takeover at the central level of, let's say, surveillance power on the two sides of the budget, so on the spending side and on the revenue side, so being very intrusive? Some think that. I don't think so. I don't think that there is a need and definitely not the political feasibility in order to go into a very intrusive way. So that is, I think, can be left to the national level, and countries would decide to do what they wish on that front. We have, as part of this more softer type coordination, we have recommendation of that, but it is not, it is not compulsory to follow that. And I think a part of the fiscal union is also the backstop for banking union, being and the ESM is part of that, and the crisis management, which is again the ESM. So I would characterize the fiscal union needed for a proper functioning monetary union is a central fiscal capacity, fiscal backstop for properly functioning banking union, and a crisis management, crisis response system that would tackle systemic problems that we have. So I think this is needed. We are halfway into this. We have made progress on each one of the dimensions. Some more. ESM is there. Some and on the fiscal backstop. Hopefully we get it. We should be able to get it in December at the Euro Area Summit. On the fiscal capacity, objectively, this is a longer road to go there. So yes, fiscal union, but not a fiscal union which is all-encompassing, intrusive role of Brussels on managing national budgets. So I've taken a long time for this in order to squeeze my time out for the second, for the second question. And I think, okay, let me remain delicate on this. I mean, on the two views that Adam put forward, I think, as I said it before, we are before us a quite, substantial, if not critical, choice. And I don't think we can treat what is happening or risks to happen at the global level as business as usual. And I think there is a big chance of Europe playing its role in this. And actually, I would see this external role, contribution to global leadership, as an additional motivation to finalize a number of open chantier that we have in Europe. It is true that in order to do so, we would need to have stronger political leadership that we are seeing now. Hopefully, come the next European elections, there would be more outburst of awareness. Let's put it like that, which would acknowledge that we have a responsibility to cooperate to solve our problems collectively, and the sum of national individual solutions do not adapt necessarily or at all to a common strategy. So far, what has been done, the Monnet approach and the Schuman-Monnet approach has been that euro evolves through crisis and response to the crisis. This, to a certain extent, is also what has happened during the Great Recession. And the economy is a way to bring the politics together. I think there are two considerations I would like to end up with this. The first one is that having achieved what we have achieved in terms of sharing economic, financial, and monetary sovereignty, I think one cannot hide anymore behind that. And I think the issue of political integration has to be put on the table explicitly and not only implicitly. So I don't think we can do more doing it by stealth. So this is the first point. And I think the second point is that I repeat what we indicated before. I think we have an opportunity now. Let's hope that there is sufficient political leadership in order to achieve what is needed. I think it's pretty evident that the minimum critical mass for responding to a number of problems cannot be anything smaller than the EU or the Euro area.
Thank you very much, Marco, for that fascinating.